What kind of sparked your interest in connecting neuroscience and faith and really the power of narrative?
Had my attention from the beginning is what we read about in the opening lines of Paul's letter to the church at Rome.
There's this grand meta narrative taking place and playing out all throughout history.
The beginning, the creation has spoken to humankind about God's nature and God's power.
Welcome back to the Ministry Growth Show. Today on the show, I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Curt Thompson. We've talked about Dr. Thompson often on this show and quoted him quite often. He's the author of Anatomy of the Soul and The Soul of Shame, among a list of other notable titles. Dr. Thompson, super excited to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Zach, it's great to be here. As we were saying before we started the recording, I'm just really humbled and gratified to be speaking with someone who's working so hard to do this work that's really not easy to do. So it's a joy to be with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to get into it. So your work has, as I've said, both already online and offline, deeply shaped how I view storytelling as essential, yet maybe often overlooked in the church today. What kind of sparked your interest in connecting neuroscience and faith and really the power of narrative?
Well, Zach, I think in some respects, ever since I wrote Anatomy of the Soul, one of the things that had my attention from the beginning is what we read about in the opening lines of Paul's letter to the church at Rome, when he remarks that from the beginning, the creation has spoken to humankind about God's nature and God's power.
Mm-hmm.
And the world that we are exploring and that is revealing itself to us in neuroscience, in my particular field of interpersonal neurobiology, is part of that created form of the world that we encounter that tells us things about how we operate. Now, and so one of the things that we're discovering is that neuroscience itself and research in brain development, research that really reveals how brain development and relational interactions are so deeply connected, and how our attachment patterns set the groundwork for so much of what's actually happening in our bodies over the course of time. This is all an expression of the mechanics of how we as human beings are intended to operate when we flourish. And one of the primary things that we discover when we look at how we human beings emerge, even just looking at, just observing data, is that we, like no other creatures, come into the world and become storytellers. When you look around, as far as we know, unless you're in some C.S. Lewis novel, we're not like squirrels or deer or other animals that are able to remember and are able to anticipate things in the future, but their degree of consciousness is not like ours by virtue of our capacity to self-report what is going on internally. And one of the things that we find is that human beings eventually become storytellers invariably, and you don't have to train them to do this. Little ones, they come to you and they start to talk, and then they want to tell you things. And we discover that one of the fundamental ways of what it means for us to be human is that first we sense the world that is coming to us from outside our skin. We sense the world that is coming to us from inside our skin. And that's not just what I sense in my chest or my GI tract, but also what I sense in my emotional states that I contain in my body. I'm sensing all these things that are coming to me from outside and from within. And then I have to make sense of it. I am trying to give meaning to this amalgamation of neurobiochemical and electrical energy that we are exchanging with the world and with each other. How do we make sense of what we sense? And there are many stories that the world offers that invites us to choose from, whereby which we would make sense of what we sense. There are the stories of atheistic evolutionary materialism, in which we Just so the story is, there's nothing that came before, nothing that's coming after. That's just who we are. Which frankly isn't much of a story to me.
Mm-hmm.
But of all the stories that are out there that tell us about what it means for us to be storytellers, remember, I can see that I'm a storyteller. I don't need the Bible to tell me that. I can see this from the creation that Paul writes about in Romans chapter 1. But then how do we make sense of the fact that we are storytellers? And that leads us to this bigger question of how it's just invariably human beings are naturally curious about the story that they believe they're living in. In what story? Like, there are not many people that are relatively healthy to whom you say, does it matter to you what your life is going to be like today? And most people are not going to say, like, no, it doesn't really matter to me. I don't really care about me. And no, it turns out like you can't escape this reality that we are storytellers. And in fact, when you read the first page of the Bible, we get to the end and we see that God, and according to the Bible, God has made humans to be like God, like no other creature.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that we see about what it means to be like him is, if we were going to just look at the first page, we know that God is an artist. He's making things. He's bringing order and purpose to things. So he's an architect. He's not just making stuff randomly. There's purpose in this. And there is a sense in which God is telling a story about how he's going about this. So we are artists, and we are people who tell stories about the things that we've made. And as it turns out, that's exactly who we are when you just look at the data. And so then the question becomes, well, what is the story that we read about in the Bible? And this magnificent notion that we were made to create beauty and goodness in the world, and that we were made to become those icons of beauty and goodness, to recognize that we haven't done a very good job of it, that we have all kinds of ways of screwing this up. And then we give it to our children and we screw them up, and we screw all the things.
Right.
And this story then says that God, though, still has not given up on his mission for human beings to become the people that we need to become in order for us to rule the world as he gave us our first imprint to do. But for us to do this, we need a model who can show us how to do it. And we need someone who can rescue us from ourselves, who can help us do it. And it's in this person of Jesus that we would say the story finds its culmination. And that his coming and his going the first time is just the beginning of this grand story that we are part of. And so we who are Jesus followers would say we are telling a story that neuroscience would support, and that we believe that this is a story that can answer all of our questions, even in a world in which questions and answers often seem fraught with imperfection and inconclusivity. All that may be true. And we would say, oh, yes, and our king said, we live in a world in which we will have tribulation. That's the story. We live in a world that is difficult. And then he said, oddly enough, he didn't say, and that's really tough. He didn't say, but, it'll be okay. He said, be of good cheer. And of course, I'm looking around and thinking, like, how in the world am I supposed to be a person of good cheer in a world that is fraught with tribulation? And this is what the gospel narratives tell us. They tell us this is how we do this. We do this in the context of community. We do this in the context of the power and presence of the Holy Spirit. We do this because we believe we live in a story. He who began a good work has come to rescue us and will not be done until it's finished. And that's a pretty good story.
Yeah. That's one of the most fascinating things to me, is that there's this grand meta narrative taking place and playing out all throughout history. And the fact that he chooses to invite us into partnership with him in that redemptive narrative, a narrative that he could have just done on his own, but he chooses to invite us into partnership with him in that story. And I think one of the most impactful things about my reading of Anatomy of the Soul, completely changed my theology. Thank you. But this idea that not only am I invited into that narrative, but there is that grand meta narrative taking place and playing out, and that my story plays a part in that larger scale narrative. That's crazy.
I hope we are recording this sermon that you're preaching.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. And so, I mean, that is the reality in which we live. I mean, you've said it already that we are storytellers. I think there's a realization and a recognition generally that we know we are storytellers, and that telling our stories truthfully can lead to transformation. Why then do you think the church, particularly maybe within the last few centuries, has drifted from this practice, that logic and reason has ruled the day and been the thing that we lead with, particularly in, I think, our disciple making processes and practices, and not emphasize maybe enough the storytelling piece?
Yeah. Well, you know, Zach, it's a great question, and I think, you know, we have in the last 500 years of what we might call modernity that has then kind of bled into what we call postmodernity. It is fashionable for us to imagine that we have moved away from storytelling and that we're moving into a more rationalistic, more logical, linear way of interpreting the world. And that's not untrue, but I think it is important for us to remember that the first maneuver toward a dominantly left hemispheric way of making sense of what we sense begins on the third page of the Bible. This is not just new to our era or to the era of modernity. It begins not just with the story that we tell, but the way people tell stories. It's the way we tell them. It is impossible for humans to not tell stories. Even when we think that all we're doing is talking about the facts. When I'm talking about the facts, if you were to ask us, you know, I'm thinking of a number of people that I have walked with over the course of the years as a clinician, and you were to ask them, could you please tell me your story? And they do, and they give you a nice logical linear thread about what happened to them. And you might be wondering, well, wait, where's the emotion? Where's the relational interchange? Where's the this? Where's the that? But if you were to look at the facts on the ground, they would have included everything that could be possibly included in terms of the facts as you might see it on a video recorder. But there would be elements of that story that would be missing. The emotional content, the wounding, the lack of repair of ruptures, all those things that we wouldn't necessarily be able to see on a silent video, but that we would feel. And so what happens when the serpent comes to the woman and says, is not true? Is it true? What God has said, is that true? It's not just, is he checking her facts? No, the very nature of how the conversation begins to unfold. As we like to say, shame showed up in the garden long before any fruit was eaten. There is an implicit bent toward violence in the nature of how the serpent is telling the story. And so by the time you get to modernity, by the time you get to post-Renaissance times, by the time you get to the Enlightenment and so forth, it's not hard to see how in Western Europe, people were using the Enlightenment as a way to cope with unfinished traumatic business. It became a cultural way of moving things largely into the left hemisphere of how we operate in the world and not having an integrated right and left hemisphere of the brain interaction with our world. In the Gilchrist writes persuasively of this in The Master and His Emissary, this whole notion of how it is that we perceive the world is then becomes how we tell the story about the world. And we in the church perhaps were unaware of how the stories were being told differently. And hence, we then decided that we were going to bargain with the devil on his terms. And so it became important for us to know when Descartes comes along and says, and the Pope is afraid that we're going to lose the church because of all these things that are happening in the world where people know so much. Descartes comes along and says, well, we'll try to match you. Logic for logic, right? Fact for fact.
Mm-hmm.
And when we recognize, and when Leslie Newbigin comes along, the great British theologian and missiologist, and he says, look, we defend the gospel by preaching the gospel. We don't defend the gospel by explaining it, by giving you all the 10 reasons why you logically believe. We defend the gospel by telling you a story. We defend the gospel by bringing you a story about a person who comes to those who are broken and loves them. What's that like? Is there any logic in this? Is there any logic to someone who would allow himself to be stripped naked, beaten, hung on a cross, and then says, Father, forgive them? In fact, there's no logic there, but there is a story there. And so it's often the case. We see this. It often comes out when people want to have debates about things about faith and science and so forth and so on. And I'm often just observing that in those places, we're really trying to offer factual responses to people's factual responses. At least that's what it appears to be. When really, in effect, what we're doing is we're both trying to cope with our unfinished business by offering facts as a way to respond to people's questions, as opposed to our own curiosity and our own willingness to be vulnerable with them, and our own willingness to ask them questions about what's painful for you, what happened to you, not what's right or wrong with how you think, but what happened to you in your story, such that we're even having this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want there to be a God, or do you not want there to be a God? That's a different question than what are the reasons that you believe God is real or not? And all of that requires that we each contend with what we would say are the essences of our attachment processes. My tendency to want to present the gospel as a set of facts has everything to do with my attachment processes. It has everything to do with the way that I typically tend to want to find comfort in the world by knowing that I know that I know, which is exactly what the woman wanted to do as a coping strategy when she took the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because if I know that I know that I know, then I can protect myself from having to trust somebody who's going to burn me. For me to tell a story of vulnerability and then invite and allow that story to seep into the consciousness of those who are hearing the story and trust the Spirit is going to work with that is a very different posture than giving people theological downloads, which we assume that once you are given this information, this will help you make everything work out with all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted, which is something that evil is counting on. Because evil knows that that's not why we come to believe in God. We come to believe in God because we feel the felt sense of what it means to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure. We don't want to live in a world where that's not happening. And we're always going to be contending with the fact that the thing that I most desperately long for in the world, beloved, is also the thing that I am supremely the most terrified of. I love the idea of love until love shows up at my door. Because it comes not only with its longing for intimacy, its desire to heal, but also comes with its demands for me to be vulnerable. Its demands for me to become a person of living, breathing, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, all the things that I'm very not good at.
Right.
It wants me to be a living, breathing Sermon on the Mount. And that's when I come to discover just how broken I am, how much forgiveness I need, because I can't do these things that Jesus asks me to do. Not unless I'm allowing him to love me enough to help me do that.
That's good. Yeah. I mean, for a little bit of context for you, the space that we play in, I run an agency called Reliant Creative. How I would define my call is to help the church testify of all that Jesus is doing, and that particularly manifests itself within the marketing and communication space in
Mm-hmm.
Reliant Creative.
Mm-hmm.
It's not till reading your book and seeing the implications for storytelling in the disciple making space and in leadership development that my horizons for where storytelling can be applied kind of expanded. But that's where I spend most of my time. And the struggle of my career has been to get the ministry world to use story and narrative as the primary driver for our communication efforts.
Mm-hmm.
We like the idea of it. We talk about it a lot. But when it
Mm-hmm.
comes down to actually putting storytelling into practice as the driver for all of our marketing communication
Mm-hmm.
efforts and the
Mm-hmm.
content that we
Mm-hmm.
create in the digital space, most ministries, and in our research, 99% of the content being created by the church on a global scale has nothing to do with story.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question then becomes for me, why is that, and how can we help solve that problem? Because if I
Mm-hmm.
can't get you to use storytelling for the sake of and the benefit of your organization and ministry and
Mm-hmm.
in all facets and aspects of ministry, then I'm not going to be able to be effective at helping and coming alongside your organization and your leaders.
Right. Right.
So how do we solve that problem? And the thing that we've there's a wide variety of reasons why we don't use story. But I think that,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, at the root of it seems to be it requires a level of vulnerability that most of us are uncomfortable with. In
Yeah.
order to actually tell my story or to use story to tell somebody else's story, it requires a level of vulnerability that we're not okay with. And
Right.
until we can at least recognize that's the true reason why we're not storytelling. When I ask for a story from the field on an organization that's doing international missions work and they can't get a story from the field, it's not often a communication barrier. It's not a cultural barrier. Like, these stories transcend culture. These stories
Mm-hmm.
transcend language.
Mm-hmm.
It usually ends up being there's a element of this on the vulnerability side that causes us not to be able to get stories out, to be able to tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and like you said, if I'm honest about my own relationships in my life, like, the more vulnerable I am in my relationship, whether that's with my wife or a friend, the deeper that relationship ends up going
Right.
in
Right.
all circumstances.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things that I would say that I've observed. I've had the privilege of working with a number of um, ministry organizations in which a subset portion of each of those ministry organizations is committed to the spiritual formation of its members.
Hmm.
And it's a curious thing to note that on a number of occasions, what has been reported to me is that the parent organization, which has established this subset system within itself, whose task it is to minister to its members and to create space for spiritual formation, which in many respects is the very thing that you're talking about. It's inviting people to tell their story more truly. This is
Mm-hmm.
how durable transformation of human beings happens. Uh, Oddly enough, many of those subset portions of these organizations will report that once they are commissioned, it is often the case that they do not receive the kind of support that they would think they would receive from the folks who are actually in charge of the parent organization.
Hmm.
Because so often, the way we are being primed and how we have also been primed by modernity, the notion of capitalism. And by that, I don't mean capitalism versus some other kind of, but this notion of expansion, this notion of scale, this notion of GDP, these ways of thinking economically that upward and to the right is always, the defining quality of what it means for something to be good and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
What we find is that so much of how we even imagine or measure that we are doing what we are called to do has everything to do with things like how many people come to my church service?
Mm-hmm.
What are the numbers of ministries that we have? What are the number of different subgroups of people that we are reaching? We've added X number of new members to our church this year and so forth. So much of how that is a way of imagining the world and the way the biblical narrative tells its own story that is actually quite counter to the biblical narrative itself. I find myself being deeply moved and influenced by the series The Chosen.
Mm.
And one of the things that we see is that the character that Jenkins and others are creating in Jesus, that Jonathan Rumi plays, is someone who appears to be supremely focused on what is happening right in front of him. You don't seem to be, we're not encountering someone who is thinking about scaling his church.
Mm.
We're not thinking about something that's happening next week or the week after or 10 years from now. We're talking about somebody who is supremely confident in what they are doing right in front of them and allowing the work of the Spirit to take that work and do for it what it will do. The work of spiritual formation, as we like to say, the most durable artifacts of beauty in the world are those artifacts that take the longest time to make. Snowflakes are gorgeous. They are here and gone in 3 seconds. Grand Canyon, different kettle of fish.
Mm.
And so for us, you look at the arc of scripture, we think like, why did God not send Jesus right after Cain kills Abel? I mean, like it would have been so much more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't God be more efficient with us? Instead, it would appear just looking at the arc and the time travel that God is taking in the biblical narrative, like God is slow, is intentional on purpose because he intends to be completely thorough with us. There is not going to be a stone that he's going to leave not turned over. He's not going to leave a stone unturned in my soul when it comes to the things that he wants to do to change. And that takes a long time to get me to cooperate with him.
Mm.
This notion of growth as a function of depth and internal expansion, rather than up and to the right on a flat scale graph, is a very different way of understanding what it means for us to extend the gospel in the world. And so the whole notion of doing things expansively and to scale, this requires the kind of action in our brains that takes it in some respects it's much faster for me when you come to me, Zach, and you have a problem and I give you the 3-step answer to the problem. It's not just that I'm giving you a solution, I'm reducing my own personal anxiety very, very quickly.
Mm.
For me to sit with you and be curious with you, that's going to take time, and we don't get to the solution of the problem right away. Just like God has not gotten to the solution of the problem right away. What were the Hebrews doing? 400 years, it's estimated, that they're sitting in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
depending upon who you're reading. And so when you're doing your work in marketing, and we say we want to invite people to be storytellers, it's difficult for us to do this if we have not had much practice telling our own story to someone who's listening to us long enough.
Mm.
And then inviting us to enter into all those nooks and crannies that we've never thought even to go. I'm reminded of a person that I work with, I've been working with for a number of years now, and it's a story that I tell often. When I first met him, this is a person who was extraordinarily successful in life as a business person. He bought and sold 3 businesses in his early 40s, and this is just amazing. But he was very anxious.
Mm.
And one would look at his life and wonder, what's going on? Why are you so anxious? And you ask the question of him, well, tell me, what was it like growing up in your house? Maybe you've heard me say this before. What was it like growing up in your house? He said, I grew up in a loving Christian home. And this is the straightforward, easy answer that he gives, that he would give to anybody and clearly has given to lots of people. Well, tell me, what was it like in your house? Well, I grew up in a loving Christian home. It's fast, it's efficient, it's a logical, linear way to tell my story. And then if we like to say, yeah, and it's also the way that we say, yeah, life kind of sucked, but I'm not really actually able to say that. So I grew up in a loving Christian home. And then we ask the next question. So who is in charge of discipline in your house? Right? Not the kind of common question that we're usually used to asking or answering at cocktail parties. It's like not the kind of things we're. And he said, well, that would have been my mom. And as he thought more about that, he said, because anytime my dad, who was a deacon in the church, got involved, things would become violent in the house.
Mm.
Now, here we have a man, bright, articulate, educated, thoughtful, kind, caring. His employees love this guy.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that one can say, I grew up in a loving Christian home in one breath? And then you come to find out his home was a war zone. How is that? How is that? These are two completely different stories.
Right.
But we find ourselves, it's like we say, and this is where neuroplasticity becomes a thing. I become what I pay attention to, because what I pay attention to, I remember. And if I remember things over and over and over again, those neurons that fire together wire together. And the story that I tell is the story that has actually happened, which is why the fish goes from being 6 inches long to 60 inches long. Because if I practice over enough time imagining a story in which that's the fish I caught, that is what becomes what is a fact for me.
Mm-hmm.
But my body, as the body of this guy would remind us, the things that come out of my mouth are very different than the things that my body remembers when I start to imagine being in that kitchen of my family's when I'm 15 years old and my father is really going at it with my sibling. And I'm doing everything I can to keep my head down and to try to make peace with everybody.
Mm.
Can you imagine the story that this guy actually senses and feels and tells with his body when it comes to his relationship with Jesus, when it comes to his relationship with God the Father?
Mm-hmm.
He's smart enough to know what all the theology tells him, but that's not what his body believes. His body is living in a very, very different universe. And so if we who are in the ministry, if we have not had the opportunity, as this guy eventually did, to have his story actually heard and understood in its fullness, so that he could tell his story more truly, not just including all of his traumas, but for his traumas to be met by the living Christ, for his traumas to be met and healed, ones that he heretofore had not wanted to bring into any room, let alone this particular room. He would just like to come in and have me give him the answer to why he's anxious, write a prescription, or maybe do 3 sessions of therapy, and then we're all done, packaged and wrapped, just like the rest of the world tells us that our story should be able to be told.
Mm.
But our stories are not like that. We are people of great longing, and we are people of great carnage and grief. We are people of rage. We are people of sadness. We are people of addiction. We are people of all kinds of things with no one to tell that to. And because of all of that, I have to burn lots of energy to keep it contained, because heaven forbid that it would start to spill out in the room in front of my congregation.
Mm.
But if I'm the pastor whose story has actually been told and has been heard, and I know some pastors out there who are like this, I will tell you, these are the pastors who know what it means to recognize that all theology was first an experience that somebody had, and now they are making sense of what they've sensed. Before Paul wrote Romans, Paul had his own experience of what it was like to be the guy who on one day was on the warpath killing people and throwing people in jail. Then he gets knocked off his horse. But before the dust settles, he's told, I'm going to take you to you who are now blind and can't see a thing. I'm going to send you to the house of someone who you in another life would have been going to arrest. And if I'm Paul, can you imagine? Like, I'm thinking like, dude, like they're going to kill me.
Mm,
And if I'm Ananias, I'm thinking like, I'm thinking of killing him before he kills me.
right.
We would not imagine a story in which God brings a man of violence into the house of someone that he yesterday would have killed and have that man treat him with loving kindness. Like, we wouldn't come up with that story.
Right.
So when Paul writes about grace, this is a dude who is not writing about it because he's just really, really wicked smart. He's writing about it because he's a guy who knows what it means to have been rescued by the very people that he was coming to kill, which you can imagine is going to do a number on anybody who thinks they know that they know that they know.
Mm,
And no wonder he can write what he writes. And it gets hijacked in a world of modernity where what we really want to do is just teach theology and think that if that's what we do, that that's going to be enough, without first recognizing that long before Paul wrote Romans, Paul was having an experience within himself and between himself and other people who were doing things with him and for him that were blowing his mind. And if we aren't having that same kind of experience as pastors, it's going to be hard pressed for me to believe that the story of the Bible is first that. It is first a story, and then we begin to make sense of it. Yes, through our theology and through our catechism and through our teaching and all those kinds of things. That's a lot. I'll stop.
no, that's great. Um, so then, what are maybe some practical things that ministry leaders can do to reclaim storytelling as a primary
Yeah.
a primary tool for spiritual formation rather than relying on this intellectual propositional teaching and leadership development and organizational growth, like all these things that we talked about
Yeah.
that I think have been maybe more influenced by our culture.
Mhm.
How do we reclaim that? How do ministry leaders reclaim that when oftentimes they haven't even experienced it themselves?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. That I'm only going to be compelled to the value of what it means to tell the story when I first and foremost have had the sense that my story has been fully seen, soothed, safe, made to be secure.
Mm,
When I have had the experience of me being fully understood and I'm willing to be in the game. We there is a we're familiar with the story of the woman who comes to Jesus, like with for commando healing in Mark 5, right? The woman with a bleeding problem, and she has her
mm-hmm,
plan, she acts it out, and then everything goes awry when he says, "Stop, who touched me?"
mm-hmm,
And she has an idea in her head about how ministry is supposed to go. And here's the plan, like because the text reads, because she thought in her mind, if only I could touch his garment, I will be healed. This is not untrue. Our theology is not untrue. The things that we want to sort of disseminate, it's not untrue.
right.
The tricky part for her was that she gets there, she touches him, and then like all the wheels come off. And in Mark's text, it's so beautiful, right? Because this is the text that is moving rapidly, like it's just a fast moving text, and it pauses the reader long enough to say, and when she finally got up the courage to come to him, like she's going to like, because he's like, who was it?
Right.
And the text reads, and she came with fear and trembling. We would have thought, look, if this woman, if her healing, if all that she needed was to have her bleeding be stopped, she could have that be done and she can make tracks and nobody knows anything. She does not have to show herself. But there was something that was compelling her about his inquiry. Who touched me? Who is here in the crowd that is hungry and thirsty to the point where you really want it more than anybody else here, maybe except for the guy whose daughter I'm going to heal? She comes with fear and trembling. And so here's a question. Until and or unless we as pastors and as ministry leaders are first able to come with fear and trembling and fall at his feet because we are about to be found out. And then what does the text read? And she came with fear and trembling, and she told him everything there was to tell him about herself.
Mm.
Like, dude, like this, she's not having a private, like, psychotherapy consultation hour. This is in
Right.
front of a crowd that she's telling this story because Jesus knows that her bleeding is just the tip of the iceberg. If she's bleeding like this for 12 years, like she's not married, she doesn't have kids, she doesn't have a family, she probably doesn't have a community. Like, what's she then going to do? Because he sees that the healing for her is so much more extensively needed than just her bleeding. And it's true for every single one of us. I think I have an idea about what I need. We as ministry leaders, we think we know what other people need. Oh, people out there bleeding, we're going to give this. And then Jesus shows up and says, are you willing in front of people to tell me everything there is to tell me about yourself? We like to ask the question, and I would ask this to our listeners, who are ministry leaders. We would ask the question, can you, if I were to ask, could you give me the names of at least 3 people who collectively, if I were to ask them, they could tell me everything there is to know about you? They would know your greatest dreams, your greatest fears, your longings, your griefs. They would know the last time you gossiped about the pastor. They would know the last time you looked at porn. They would know all the things. They would know all the things. They would know the things that you most want, that you're afraid to say that you want. Because if you can't tell me the names of 3 people who can do that, then I can tell you you're burning energy containing unfinished business that is not allowing God to do with you in your ministry work what he wants to do. And
Mm.
he is not like Jesus is not like measuring benchmarks for how many more people do we have in our church. Jesus is asking, are you in the game of allowing me to know your story to its depth in order for me to transform the people around you that you are bumping elbows with every day?
Mm.
And allow them then to transform others because of the same thing. Because you, with fear and trembling, are allowing me to know you, even the parts of you that you don't know that need to be transformed. Storytelling is how that happens. In the same way that God in Jesus comes to us and tells us his story. The 7 great I ams in John's gospel. I am the bread of life. I am the living water. All those 7. We would say that as Christians, these are words of comfort and joy for us. It tells us who Jesus knew himself to be. And as it turns out, they are also the very words that got him killed.
Mm.
It is that kind of vulnerability that leads to Good Friday, that leads to Easter. And it is, this is in these confessional community groups that we run, we have evidence time after time after time of the number of people whose lives are being transformed because of their capacity and courage in being vulnerable in this community, and people's lives who are being transformed because they can receive the vulnerability of the stories that they are hearing that enable those people to move into their lives to create beauty and goodness where heretofore they couldn't even imagine it.
Mm. So that's where that incredibly important community aspect comes into play. That question you asked, do you have 3 people that know everything about you, that know the most intimate details about your life? That until that exists for ministry leaders, that then they can go and replicate that within their staff and the rest of the organization.
Right.
Like that's where that community aspect and development and knowing and being known comes into play.
Right.
And I
And it does
can't teach, I can't build structures around that. I can't build staff around that until I've experienced that myself.
That's right. And this bumps up against the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? She saw that it was good to the eye, it's pleasing to the eye,
Mm-hmm.
it's great for knowledge, and it gives one personal autonomy. And when I have unfinished business in my own story, I'm looking for everything I possibly can that I can take that will help distract me from myself,
Mm-hmm.
including the success that I can have in doing ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's tricky. Evil takes that which is good and right and beautiful. It's important to know the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in and of itself, was not a bad thing. The problem was not the tree. The problem was not the fruit. The problem was the way in which Adam and Eve approached it. They took rather than waiting to receive from the tree of life. And so much of my behavior is me taking things as a way to cope with me.
Mm-hmm.
Even when the mission, even when my intention, like it's good for wisdom, it's good for these are good things that we're doing. And the real question I would really want to, I like, at the end of the day, can we say that the people with whom we share life are people who are of greater fruit of the Spirit, are more like the Sermon on the Mount than they were a year ago? Is who are we becoming? And those questions that explore my depth and capacity for resilience and durability and followership of Jesus has everything to do with the degree to which he's having greater and greater access to the parts of my story that heretofore still believe I'm at war with God, like Paul writes about in Romans 5. We have peace with God, except for the parts of me that don't believe that I do. And if I'm in relationship with you, Zach, and week after week, we're having conversations where we're not leaving any stone unturned with each other, it means that the Holy Spirit is going to use you to turn over the stones within me where I have that unfinished business in order for healing and regeneration and recommissioning to take place. So that because I'm now seen by you, because I'm now not alone, those parts of me that were alone, before we spoke, I'm now not alone in the way that, like, it's not good for the man to be alone. These parts are now recommissioned because I'm being seen by somebody for the very first time in a way that I could never have imagined. In the way that the woman with the bleeding problem was seen by Jesus in a way that she did not see coming.
Hmm. And that's where that I think the quote I use from you most often is this. I'll butcher it, but this idea that when I share my story and I hear others sharing their story with me, it's both a healing process for the storyteller and the person receiving the story. And this back and forth engagement is exactly what you just talked about, right? I'm laying bare the deepest, darkest secrets of my life. And that level of intimacy and vulnerability in that process physically is a healing process.
That's right. That's right. We have good evidence that would indicate that when we are seen for the first time in ways that allow me to be present to you and not defensive, it literally turns on neural networks, turns on brain cell circuits in my mind, in my brain, that before you and I had the conversation were not turned on. When Paul writes about, therefore, don't be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, I'm not thinking he's thinking that he's talking as a neuroscientist. But the neuroscience that we now see would certainly reflect exactly what he's talking about.
Right.
And that what he's talking about is not just mere metaphor, but he's really talking about a God who is in the business of transforming our bodies, even as our bodies are dying.
Mm.
Nobody gets out alive. But even as we are dying, God is already making new things that are helping us practice for and giving us a hint of what's coming. And what he's trying to do is to help us practice so that we're ready for it when it shows up.
Knowing and being known. I think that idea is just, well, scary, like we've touched on already. Like to actually know and be known by those around us, like, but also by God. That's a crazy invitation. I mean, yeah.
I have often cited this book. I was really, I was deeply moved by and found it to be very helpful. This is more than 20 years ago. There's a guy named Paul Borgman, and he, at the time, was a professor of literature at Gordon College, north of Boston. And he taught a course on Genesis every year as a literature course, not as a theology or Bible course, but as a literature course. And that course then became a book called Genesis, the Story We Haven't Heard.
Okay.
And in this book, Borgman raises a question that has intrigued me, captivated me, because his point in teaching Genesis as literature is to say, like, look, the Hebrew Bible scholars who collated and collected the Hebrew scrolls, like, they're doing it purposefully to tell a story a certain way. And Genesis is the beginning of this story, to your point. And he asks this question. He says, who knows how many people God asked to go with him to Canaan before in Abraham he finally found someone who said, yes, I'll go. And he said, we don't know because there's no story that's been told about it. And that just really captivated me, because he's emphasizing a couple of things. Number one is that God longs for partnership. He wants a partner. He's not just going to go. Like, God could go to Canaan and do whatever he wants. Like, he wants a partner, just like he wanted with Adam and Eve, just like he wanted with Cain, just like he wanted with Noah. He wants a partner. To our listeners, God wants to partner with you, with us. The second thing is, he doesn't force his partnerships. He doesn't make us do things. And even along the way, he chooses partners that behave badly. Abraham throws his wife under the bus not once, but twice. He then goes on to impregnate a slave girl, not even his wife. Like, there's all kinds of ways in which Abraham does not deal honestly with God. God continues to faithfully work with this guy, because what we see over time is that Abraham himself is having to tell his story differently over time. The story that he tells when he goes into Hagar is like, God can't ultimately be trusted with this. I can't trust God with this. There's a part of him that is not ready to believe in God. And God's like, okay, there's going to be a consequence for your choice. We're going to call that circumcision. There's going to be a consequence for your choice, painful one, but he's still willing to work with him. But then the story changes. And the story continues to change right up to Jesus. And this notion that whole arc between Genesis and the New Testament is an arc that God is acting out with each one of us, that he wants partners with. I am an imperfect player with him. I'm sure I'm driving him crazy most days. And yet he continues to work. But as he does so, my story that I'm telling is changing. There is more of me that trusts God now than I did 5 years ago. And that means that there's more of my story that believes in the God of the Bible than what I believed 5 years ago. And this way of transforming us along the way is trying to get us ready for having as much of us as possible that is believing in the kingdom, such that when it shows up, I'm going to be solid enough to at least tolerate a little bit so that I can then really get on board when it comes in its fullness.
Hmm. I think this is shifting a little bit, but this is something that my buddy and I have talked about quite often is maybe the spiritual formation movement of the last 50 years has a better understanding of what we've been talking about than the rest of the church. With that said, like why do you think, and maybe you do see movements coming out of that spiritual formation world, but I can't seem to find any. Like what is, and on the other end of the spectrum, the disciple making movements of the world that are so structured and programmatic and do it this way and it's guaranteed to work. Like what maybe has caused the spiritual formation movement not to, I don't know. Again, this comes back to what you and I already have discussed, that we quantify success by like the scale of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily success.
All right. If you had stopped history in the year 100 AD, there would be very little to write about regarding Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
If you'd stopped history in 200 AD, there wouldn't be much to write about.
Mm-hmm.
Oddly enough, it's not until Constantine
Right.
that things changed in such a way that from a cultural standpoint, and therefore how do we think about and how do we write the histories of the world and all the things and so forth and so on, that created space for there to be an enlarging cultural impact. But all that is to say is that for the first, some historians would say, certainly for the first 100, if not maybe 200 to 300 years of the life of the church, it was not like an F-35 leaving the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan.
Right.
It's like a train pulling out of the station.
Yeah.
And yet, once that train is moving, the mass effect that it generates, like this is Jesus saying, hell will not stand against my church. It can't stop it.
Mm-hmm.
It is a train that is moving, that is coming. And as such, I think that, again, I was having a conversation with I was invited to be part of this is a beautiful experience I had. There's a church in Houston, the Story Church, interestingly enough, is what it's called. And the pastor there during the summer has a weekly gathering with the high school kids. And they have kind of like a kind of like a catechism and like a teaching time with the pastor, Sure. And there are kids who come to this, and they had had the opportunity to be on a Zoom call with them. And one of these young women asked a really prescient question. She was a senior in high school. She had been to India the summer before on a short-term mission trip with a group of people that were doing anti-human trafficking work. And she had a remarkable, amazing experience with a handful of people. But it's in India, a country of over 1 billion people. And if you just look at the numbers, they don't really give you some story of significant impact. She came back to her school and she's having conversations with her peers about this. And of course, questions start to be thrown at her from her peers. Well, yeah, but how many people didn't you help and all the things and so forth and so on. And of course, she now has questions about, gosh, what about all the, yes, there were people that we helped, but like, think of all the people that we didn't help It just does. It seems like it's so futile. The gospel is like we paused and we asked the question, of course, that often never gets asked. And that is, okay, if you were to ask any, because most of them were young women, if you were to ask any of the young women, who've been rescued,
Hmm.
was it worth it? You know what they would tell you.
Right.
And this is where I would say that God is not in the business of benchmarking things.
Hmm.
He's not going to get to the end and say, well, what about all those other people that you didn't do this, that you didn't do that? He's going to ask me what I did with the things that were put in front of me.
Hmm. That's good.
I was having a
Do you?
conversation with a leader not that long ago who was about to enter into a venture that was going to involve a lot of people, I mean, a lot of people. And this person was feeling really responsible for this large number of people and this movement that they were about to protect, perhaps launch.
Mm-hmm.
In the conversation that we had, I said, well, how many people are you having direct interaction with? And they named probably maybe about a dozen at most. I said, as it turns out, you're not responsible for all of these people. You're responsible for the people that you are dealing with.
Hmm.
This is what Jesus was doing. He was paying attention to, and he was fully 110% invested in the people who were on the ground in front of him. And I can guess that if I'm Matthew, and you've asked me to come join you in the same group where Peter is, the guy that probably hates me as much as anybody does in this group, and you're not like appearing to like work everything out so we play nice together, I'm going to depend a great deal on paying attention to you, paying attention to me. And
Hmm.
then Jesus says, now go and do likewise. If I'm going to pay deep attention to the people with whom I am interacting, if I'm a pastor and I've got 12 people on my staff, I want to know, how well do those people know that they are in your mind?
Hmm.
Do they know that they are being deeply loved by you? They are going to be far more important to what happens over the next 6 months, let alone 10 years, let alone 50 years. Heck, 150 years from now, your church that seats 15,000 people may not even be here.
Right.
We like to remind people, I don't know that there is a more beautiful piece of literature in all of the ancient scripts than what we see with Paul's letter to the Ephesians. It's like it's an unbelievable piece of literature. There is no city of Ephesus that is the ancient city, let alone there is a church. There's no church. But we have that letter,
Mm-hmm.
and we have plenty of things that we are doing right now that 100 years from now may not even be here. The question is, what am I doing with the time that I have?
Hmm.
Who are the stories of the people? Zach, that you are paying so much attention to this story. Like people's stories are being told moment by moment every day. And I would love for our pastors to imagine this question, our ministry leaders to imagine this question. What would it be like for me to imagine asking the question, how will anybody and everybody's story that I interact with today, how is their story going to be told more truly after I've had an interaction with them than it was before I had an interaction with them? In what
Hmm.
way is the Spirit drawing me to be a co-narrator with the people that I interact with? Whether it's your employee or it's the person in the checkout line at your grocery store. In what way am I being the gospel? Doing the same thing with those as Jesus was doing with the woman who had the bleeding dyscrasia.
Hmm.
These are the questions that I find the Spirit putting in front of me, not as a critique, but as an invitation that he is looking for collaborators. He's looking he's looking for co-authors. He's looking for partners.
Because he's still
For us
interested in the same thing that he was when it walked his ministry.
the same thing that he's interested in on the first page of the Bible.
Yeah. Do you think the early church understood the storytelling piece, or like to the point where they could put words to it? Like, did they understand the storytelling piece within the disciple making that was taking place then in a way that they could, I don't know, articulate it in a way that we can't, or have?
Well, again, I think I also, the guys, Tim Mackey and John Collins at the Bible Project are really, I find their work to be just extraordinarily helpful.
Oh yeah.
And, when you look at, and I've learned this from Tim, this notion of how the Hebrew Bible scholars over time, they arrange those scrolls of the Hebrew Bible with explicit intention.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole notion of telling the story the way we tell it, we're not just telling it because it's how it happened. Like, we're telling it on purpose in a certain way. And because of that, one would have to know that they were very, very aware. Like, the Hebrew Bible is like, there's probably no piece of literature in the world that's any more beautiful than that. So you've got people who know what it means to tell a story and tell it well, and that was really important for them. Yeah. Yeah.
Curt, this has been incredible. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your insights. If people want to get a hold of you, learn more about what you're doing, maybe you want to plug a new book, how can they do so? How can they learn about what you're doing?
Well, thanks, Zach. One way people can learn about the work I'm doing, I have a website, 𝙬𝙤𝙪𝙡.com, that you can see there the work that I'm doing, the opportunities for looking at some of the books that I've written, and would love for you to do that. Most people are finding out about the work that I do now probably more frequently through a podcast that I co-host with my friend Pepper Sweeney and Amy Chella, and it's called the Being Known podcast that you can access on all of your podcast platforms. And we are in the middle of recording our 11th season this time around on rupture and repair, which we're really eager to for our listeners to have access to. And then you can find out more about some of the work that we do through the Center for Being Known. It's a nonprofit organization that promotes the lay-led initiative of developing these confessional communities. You can learn more about that there. We do some of that work through our practice, New Story Behavioral Health, where we also train clinicians and helping leaders, ministry leaders as well, those who want to start these confessional communities in their particular context. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook as well, and hope that helps for our listeners. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put links in the show notes. Can I pray for you as we wrap up?
Please.
Father, I thank you so much for Curt and his insights and expertise and the story you were able to share through him during this conversation. I know that it was an immense blessing to me, and I just pray that it is for other ministry leaders. Lord, we love you. Again, we just thank you so much that we get to be partnered with you, that you've invited us into partnership in this redemptive story, and that that you've chosen to do this with us. It's crazy, and we thank you for it. I pray for blessing on Curt and his team with all that they're doing, with the ministry, with his practice, with the podcast, with his books. I know that they've been incredibly influential in my own life. And so I thank you for him and his obedience to walk in accordance with that invitation you've placed in his life, Lord. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Curt,
amen.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Zach, thank you. It's a real pleasure, and love to do it again sometime.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ministry Growth Show. If you've enjoyed it,